Alright, so let's start working on the user profile, and we are going to have 3 sections in separate videos. Before we do anything, I would like to create 2 controllers for our dashboard and profile. At the moment, we are rendering those using Inertia function, but we would need controllers for them. So let's go to terminal and start by typing php artisan make controller, and we don't need a subfolder, so I would just call it dashboard controller for dashboard, and then repeat that command. Just change dashboard to profile, so we have 2 controllers now inside the controllers folder itself. Now back in our web.php, I'm going to move this home page all the way down right above the auth routes. Then I'm going to create a middleware group so we can have all of this in one place. So the middleware we are going to use is auth. I'm just adding an array here in case we want to add something else. And we want to group this. So let's pass a function here and then end this statement. And we just want to move these 2 routes within this group. So for our dashboard, we want to use a get request, and we don't need this part anymore. We can pass an array and use our dashboard controller. And we will have a method in that controller. I would call it index. And for the middleware, I can delete the auth middleware, but I want to keep the verified. So if the user is not verified, they cannot access their dashboard. And of course, the name is going to be the same. Then we want to do the same thing for the profile page. So let's change the request to get. And this part, which is the component, we will change it to an array, and we will bring in our profile controller. And the method that is going to render that page, I would call it edit, because it will consist of multiple forms. Now we don't need middlewares on this one because it's inside the auth group, and that's the only one I want for this page. And of course, the name that is going to be the same. So now let's go to dashboard controller first and create our index function. So let's say public function index, and we just want to return inertia render. So our dashboard component is called dashboard inside the pages folder. So we can just say dashboard like this, and we can close this, then go to our profile controller and do the same thing here. Public function, this time edit, and same thing. We want to return inertia render. And our view component is inside the profile folder, and we called it edit. Let me check just to make sure I'm doing it correctly. So pages, profile, and edit. Now let's go back to the website. I will register a new user since I don't have any. Press register. So after a few seconds, we are redirected to dashboard, but we need to verify our email, of course. But I don't want to verify it just now. For now, we will ignore this and go to profile. And this is where we want to have 3 sections to do different actions. So we can close our web.php, then open this profile edit. And to keep things organized, and we don't want to make this one component packed with code and markup, we will have 3 different components or 3 different sections, and then we will import them here. We already have this profile folder. Let's create another folder within that, and I will call it sections, or we can also call it partials. Then within that, I will have my first section, which I would call update info.view. Let's have our script tag here like this, and our template, of course. And as a starting point, we want to bring in our container. So let's say import container, and we want to import this from our components folder, which is 3 levels up. So we need to go to the components folder and the container component. So now we can use it down here and close it like this. Let's add a margin bottom because we will have other containers in other sections. So we want to have some space between them. Then let's have a div for our header with margin bottom 6 again. And then we will have our title component. So we need to import that. So let's just duplicate that line and change it to title. For the text or the title, I just want to say update information and just some text underneath. So this is our header. Next, we want our form. Let's have a form, delete the action attribute. We will have 2 input fields, one for name and one for email. So let's bring in our input field, and we need to import it, of course. And we need to provide a few props for our input field. The first one is the label, which I would call name. Then we need an icon. So I will use ID badge again. And I want to have the class and set the width to half. And we also need a vModel, but I will add that later since we don't have a form yet. And on the form tag itself, I want to have space Y6. Now let's copy that input field and paste it underneath. We just change the label to email and the icon to @ and the class is going to be the same. Then after those two input fields, I will have a div and a p tag with a text that says your email address is unverified. So the idea is to make this conditional, and when the user changes their email, they need to verify that new email. And therefore we want to show this text and also a link to resend verification email so they can verify their email. And lastly, we want our primary btn. So again, let's import that up here. And I just want to say save for the text. So this is our update info component, which is just markup at this point. And we want to use this or bring it to our edit view because that is the one we are rendering as our main profile page. So this is quite simple. We just have to import that. So we can say import update info from that folder and we can use it here. So let's just replace that div with update info and we can self-close it. So we have it right here. Let's also provide a head here with the title attribute and we will set it to profile like this. And going back to our website, we can see the form and we have the title, of course, up there and this text, which will again be conditional. So now let's go back to our update info component and create a form so we can get the data out of those input fields. So let's say const form and we will set this to use form from Inertia view. Then we will have an object within the parentheses and we need a name, which I will set it to an empty string for now, but we want to fill that with user's information. We also need an email, of course. So now we have a form instance, we can use it in our markup. So let's go to these input fields and use the vModel and attach form.name to the name input field and same thing for the email. So vModel and we can say form.email. We can also bind the disabled attribute of our button to form.processing like this. So if I format my code, it looks a bit nicer. And the next step is to grab the authenticated user information so we can fill these fields. And I think the easiest way is to send the authenticated user instance to this view as a prop. Let's do this. We can add a second argument to this render function and we will create a key, which I will call it user. And this is going to be from the request object because we want to grab the authenticated user. So let's accept the request as a parameter in this function and we can say request user, which is a function, and it gives us the authenticated user. Now we are sending this prop to the edit component, but we need it in the update info. So we can simply send it down to the child component using define props. And we say we have a user, which is type object. And down here, we can say we are expecting a user and we will bind that to the user, which is up here. So now we can just copy this define props and paste it inside update info view component. And now we have access to the user instance. So in order to use the information of this user on these fields, we can save this define props inside a variable. And down here, we can say props.user.name and same thing for the email. So props user email. And if we go back to our website, we can see the user's name and their email. Now the next step is to have a route to submit this information to. So let's open our web.php once again, and we want to create another route underneath this one. So let's have a patch route for this because we are going to modify some information in our database. And we will have the same URI or a path and of course the same controller, but we will have a different function. I would call it update info, and let's also give it a name, which I will call profile.info. All right, now let's go to our controller and create this update info function. So right underneath that edit function, I can say public function update info. We need to accept the request again because we are going to work with forms. And for now, let's just die and dump the request object. And now let's go back to our update info and attach that route to this form. And since this is going to be just one line of code, I will do it in line. But of course, we can create a function in the script tag and then use it here. So on the form tag, we can say submit and use the prevent modifier. And then we want to use our form instance here and submit this through a patch request because that is what our route expects. Then we can use the route function and use our profile.info route for this form submission. So let's see if this is working correctly. If I press save, we get our die and dump, and in the request object, we have only name and email. So now the next step is to process that information. And this is just like any other form. First, we need to validate the input fields and then save it into our database. So first, let's create a variable, and I will call it fields. And we will grab our request object and use the validate function to validate those two input fields. The first one is going to be name, which we would say it's required, and it should have a maximum value of 255. Then we will have our email, which is again required. Let's also add the lowercase rule just to make sure it is lowercase, and it must be an email. Also, the maximum value for this one is going to be 255 as well. And I want to add another rule, which is unique. So if I just type unique, VS Code will autocomplete this for me. And this rule is looking for a table and a column and an exception, which is optional. As the name suggests, this rule would make sure that this field, which is email, is unique in this particular table and the column. So for example, if I say users, that means this email input field must be unique in the users table in the emails column. So we don't have to repeat the column because they have the same name. And if I want to add an exception, I can say except ID number 2, for example, or 3 or whatever. But because we want to make this sort of dynamic and we don't want to hard code these things, we can actually use the rule class. So I will delete that and we will import rule from validations. So make sure it is imported from validations rule, and we have a unique function that is again looking for a table and a column. Now, since we are following Laravel convention and our input field is the same name as the database column and the property name in our user instance or model, we can just use the model itself. So we want to say user class. So we want this email to be unique in the user class except the currently authenticated user. And for that, we can use the ignore function, which is looking for ID, and we can use the request user ID to say except this currently authenticated user. So if the validations pass, we want to save that new information. And we want to do that on this particular user. So again, we want to grab the user, and this time we can use the fill method, which is looking for the fields we want to update. So if we want to update name, for example, we can pass an array and say name and set the new value to whatever we want. But since we already have this array up here, we can just pass it down. So whether the user changes those fields or not, we will have a value for name and email. And that's because it's already filled. And we are submitting that to the currently authenticated user information, and then we want to save those information. So again, we can grab the user and use the save function. And lastly, we want to return a redirect to the same profile page, which is this page up here. So we can say redirect to route, and the route we want to redirect to is profile.edit, and we can end the statement. So this is almost complete, but we still have to take one important step, and we will get to it in a moment. But let's open our database here, and we can see we have one user with this name and email, and it's not verified. So let's go back and change the name, for example, to Jonah, and I press save. You notice up here is changed, and also in our database, so that was correct. Now let's verify this email. So I still have that email from 25 minutes ago in my mail trap, and I think I can still use it. Yes. Anyway, my user is now verified, and you can see in my database I have a value for that field. But back to the profile page, if I change the email, for example, to John2 and save it, in our database we can see that the email was changed and it is already verified. So this is what we need to consider. So we need to unverify the user if they make a change. So let me change this back to the way it was and save it, and we still have our email verified. So let's go back to our update info function and unverify the user if they changed their email. So before saving the information, we want to take actions. So let's add an if statement. And again, we want to grab the currently authenticated user, and then using the isDirty method, check if email field was changed. So this method will return true if this field was changed. But if it wasn't changed, it would just return false, meaning nothing would happen in this if block. So if it is changed, that means it is true, and we want to unverify the user. Again, we can grab request user, and this time we want to grab email verified at property and set that to null. So this property is this column in our database. And if there is a date in here, that means the user is verified. But if they change it, we want to set it back to null. At this point, if we go back to our website and reload, we still have the same information. But if I change my email, we will unverify the user. And before doing that, let's make this text conditional so we can see the effect on our website. So we want to use the same property here. So let's just copy this and go to our update info and make this div conditional. We can just use the vif directive and say if user dot email verified at was null, then show this text, otherwise don't. So if we go back to our website, we cannot see that text because this one is verified, but if I change it and save, there we go, we have the text. And all we have to do here now is to provide a link so the user can get the new email. And of course, if we check our database, you can see the user is unverified. So I'm going to put this back to the original information and press save. And of course, we still have to verify this email address. So let's add the link here, and we already have the functionality. We just have to add a link. So if I open our auth.php for a second, this is the route we want to use, verification.send, and it's a post request. We could, of course, use an inertia link and then provide the method on this one. But what I like to do is to disable this link or a button when the user requests an email. And basically, I want more functionality than just a button. So what I like to do is to create a simple HTML button. And for the text, I want to say, click here to resend the verification email. So going back to our website, this is what we have. Now we just want to style this a bit. So let me open our text link and let's copy these classes and then go back here, paste it on the button. And we don't need the hover effect, so let's remove that just to keep things a bit simpler. And on the div itself, let's add also flex and items center. So going back to our website, this is what we have. Let's add a bit of gap also. If the email is not verified, this is what the user would see. And when they click on this, we want to disable it. So let's create a function for this button. In the script tag, I can create a resend email function, which we would make it an arrow function. And when we click on that button, we want to submit a request to that verification send route. And this is called a manual visit to a route. And if we go to Inertia documentation, we can read all about it here. So what we can do here is to grab the router from Inertia, which is imported up here. And on this instance, we have all the HTTP methods, just like the form. And the method we want to use here is post. And this function would take the route or the URL and the data, which is going to be empty for us, and the options. So let's do this. For the URL, we can use the route function. We want to submit this to verification.send. For the data, we don't need anything, so we can just pass an empty object. And for the options, we can provide another object and disable the button when we are making the request or when the request is processing. So we can say when it starts or on the start, do something. So we can just pass a function here. And when it's done, so on finish, do something else. And what we want to do here is to make this button disable or enable. So this is just a simple JavaScript. Let's grab the event inside this function. So now we have access to the event. So when we click on the button, that means on start, we want to grab target or event target, which is going to be our button, and set the disabled attribute to true. Then we want to do the same thing when the process is finished. So when it is finished, turn it back to false. That means it is enabled again if the user wants to click on it once again. So if I format the code, it looks a bit better. So we have our URL, we have our payload or data, which is empty, and we have our options. Now, all we have to do is to use this function on the button. So down here, I can say @click resend email. So let's test this out. If we click on this link, The button is disabled, but I forgot to add CSS classes. I'm sorry about that. Let's use the disabled modifier in Tailwind and say maybe change the text to some light gray. And also we can use the disabled again and set the cursor to wait. Let's do it again just to see the disabled effect. So I click on it again. There we go. It's disabled. We see the progress bar up here. And now we have a new email. So I can verify and go to profile and the text is gone. And in our database, we are verified. So one last thing I want to add for this section and this video is to add the status message. If we go to our email verification controller, this function is sending that email, right? And when that is done, we are returning back with the status message. So we can actually use this and show it to the user so they would know we did our part. I can close this one and go to our profile controller. We want to send the status session message to our component as a prop. So let's add another prop. I will call it status. And the value of this will be from our session messages with the same key, which is a status. So now we have this one. We just want to repeat the same process as what we did with this user prop. So let's add another prop, which is called a status, and it is going to be type string, and we can send it to the child component the same way. So we can say a status will be the status prop we have up there. And again, I can copy this, go back to our update info and paste it inside this define props. And in fact, I just noticed we need to show the error messages as well because we have the form. And if I delete the name and press save, we don't see any error messages. So sorry about that. Let's import our session messages and our error messages. So I will duplicate this line and change this to error messages and then duplicate it again and change it to session messages. Right, so we have these two components. Let's use them in our markup. Maybe right above the form, I will use the error messages and we will bind the errors prop to form.errors. That's for showing error messages. And then above this text for sending the email, I can use our session messages. We can say session messages and bind the status prop to our status message. All right, let's test it out once again. So let me close these pages and reload. If I delete the name and submit the form, we see the error message. If I change the name and save it, of course, it works and I can see it up here, it's changed. If I change the email and press save, we can see the text showing that our email is unverified. So let's receive an email. So when it's done, we see this text, which is again not correct. Sorry about that. So I think an easy fix is just to remove these classes from the div and move the button. So I'm going to cut it inside the p tag. So now we have our button inside the p tag and then our session messages and this div, which is the wrapper, and it is conditional. So going back to our website, now it looks much nicer, but it does work. The point is we are getting the session message, and if we reload it, it's gone. So this is our first section for updating name and email. In the next one, we will update password, and the one after that, we will see how we can delete a user account. So see you at the next one.